As the morning sun cast long shadows over Green Hill Cemetery, 82-year-old Arthur Jenkins stood in silence beside the hearse that held his beloved Eleanor. His frail frame leaned slightly on his cane, his eyes misted with tears as he tried to summon the strength to say goodbye to the woman who had stood by him for 57 years. The few mourners gathered nearby knew his story: a proud Marine Corps veteran, a carpenter, and a man of quiet dignity, now crushed beneath the weight of sorrow. Just as the pallbearers prepared to move Eleanor's casket, a young police officer pulled up in a cruiser. Officer Miller, sharp-eyed and impatient, stepped out and barked, "Move it, old man! You're blocking access!" Arthur looked up, startled. "It's my wife," he managed to say, his voice breaking. But the officer was unmoved. He demanded the hearse be moved and the road cleared. The funeral director, Mr. Henderson, tried to intervene, gently asking for a moment of patience. Miller cut him off coldly, giving a 60-second warning before threatening tickets. Arthur, dazed and overwhelmed by grief, made a slow motion toward the hearse, needing to be near Eleanor. That simple movement triggered Miller, who grabbed the elderly man's arm. Arthur instinctively pulled back and whispered, "Don't touch me." It was all Miller needed to justify his next move. In front of horrified mourners, he unholstered his taser and fired. The sound of the device cracked across the cemetery as Arthur's body convulsed and collapsed to the ground. His glasses flew from his face, his chest burned, and the last shred of dignity he held was stripped away. As he lay there, stunned and in pain, mourners wept and whispered in disbelief. A Marine veteran grieving his wife had just been assaulted during her funeral for pausing too long in mourning. The night air was heavy when Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins pressed the panic button hidden in his pocket, a tiny device given to him decades earlier for emergencies. Moments after the taser's electric jolt threw him off the hearse platform, he had grasped it instinctively, the grief and pain too much to bear alone. The button's muted click was less a cry for help than a final testament, a warrior refusing to suffer in silence again. Within seconds, a subtle series of encrypted signals flickered through the panic button's circuit. Though faint, they reached a classified Pentagon response team trained to protect veterans overlooked by civilian systems. At that instant, as Miller glared down in triumph, unseen forces were already mobilizing to correct a deep injustice. That night unfolded faster than most realize. A specially trained rapid response unit, codenamed Sentinel, was dispatched, its members already completing routine training nearby. Silent SUVs roared into action, tracing Arthur's GPS coordinates to the cemetery gates. Their approach was deliberate, fast, and disciplined. Meanwhile, Arthur gathered himself, determined to stand with dignity. His chest still burned, his body trembled, but his voice returned, weak but resolute, to speak his truth. The air crackled with anger as he spoke. "I served my country. I came to honor my wife, not to be humiliated." The cemetery's mourners watched in hushed silence, braced between sorrow and outrage. At that moment, a sleek black SUV blocked the cemetery entrance. No lights flashed, no horns blared, but its gravity was outstepped three men in plainclothes tactical gear. No insignia, no fanfare. Yet their posture and precision spoke louder than any uniform. They moved with confidence. One knelt by Arthur, another secured the immediate area, and the third monitored Miller's retreat. The driver remained inside, engine running. Their leader offered calm assistance. "Sergeant Major Jenkins, you are authorized to return to your site," he said softly, voice both respectful and commanding. Arthur blinked in disbelief as the man carefully helped him stand upright. Miller could only watch, mouth agape, as these strangers treated Arthur with dignified care. With that, the leader signaled quietly into an unseen radio. Within minutes, two dark SUVs swept in. Part of that covert, a medic gently examined Arthur, found him stable, and offered discreet encouragement. At the same time, a military liaison has stepped forward and addressed Officer Miller. "You are on camera. Do not reach for that taser again. You will accompany us to the precinct. Questions will be asked." Miller's face blanched, his authority shattered. Nearby mourners gasped. The funeral director exhaled in relief. Wordlessly, the response team loaded up by dawn. Arthur returned home, posture a bit straighter. His grief remained, but his dignity was restored. The Sentinel team had vanished as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind only a statement: no veteran shall be left voiceless again. Later, military investigators contacted city officials. Officer Miller was suspended. A full inquiry began. Funeral home staff and local law enforcement issued public apologies. An unmarked envelope arrived for Arthur, a personal letter from the secretary. That evening, Arthur sat quietly on his porch, gazing at the folded flag on his mantle. His voice was tremulous but firm. This day, I lost Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins sat at the cemetery entrance, grief still fresh and emotion raw, when suddenly his world shifted again. Only minutes had passed since the shock of the taser, but before outrage, before tears, a new presence began to enter his periphery. The distant rumble grew unmistakably louder, rolling down the road like an unspoken promise. It started soft, a low hum against the gravel, then built into something powerful and resolute. Arthur blinked, heart pounding beyond sorrow, now laced with alarm. The first vehicle to appear was a sleek yet authoritative black SUV. No flashing lights, but its posture spoke of purpose. Behind it followed a second, then a third, until 4 unmarked SUVs had formed a quiet convoy, fanning into place around the cemetery gates. They positioned themselves with tactical precision, leaving no avenue of approach unobserved. From the lead SUV emerged 3 tall figures, clad in plain clothes, but each carried an unmistakable gravitas. Their posture, their silent movements, even the disciplined calm in their eyes marked them as more than a standard funeral escort. These were Marines, special operators summoned by protocol, rising to defend a fallen hero at his moment of vulnerability. One of the Marines knelt beside Arthur, the soft gesture of placing a hand on his shoulder offering both comfort and authority. The others stood guard, silent sentinels with hawk-sharp awareness, scanning the scene. Officer Miller, still reeling from the earlier confrontation, found himself flanked by men who did not acknowledge his voice, whose presence alone commanded the space. Sergeant Major Jenkins, the kneeling Marine said quietly, his tone steady and respectful. We have arrived to ensure your safety. You are free to proceed. His voice carried decades of military discipline, yet held compassion beneath the firmness. Arthur steadied himself, his chest heaving, but no longer burned against grief and indignity. The Marine extended a hand, and with a soldier's grace, Arthur took it. Pain still etched in his frame, sorrow still weighing on his eyes. But his dignity, once shattered by the taser, began to reconstitute. He straightened, his old Marine posture quietly reasserting itself. The other Marine took position slightly behind Arthur, as if to shield him from any lingering threat. The third Marine faced Officer Miller. It was less confrontation and more containment. Miller's authority evaporated under their silent vigilance. As they guided Arthur toward the hearse, the sickening aura of humiliation was replaced by a rising sense of honor. Mourners, many of whom had frozen in horror at the taser scene, now found themselves surrounded by a living testament to what Arthur represented. The Marine's arrival transformed the setting, a space once defiled by brutality, into a solemn salute. The funeral director, Mr. Henderson, approached with tears brimming and gratitude choking his voice. Thank you, he rasped, voice thick. The lead Marine offered a respectful nod, but said nothing. In the Marine Corps, actions speak louder than words. In that moment, time regained its rhythm. 2 of the Marines assisted Arthur onto a wheelchair provided by cemetery staff. The third had already stepped forward to speak with Officer Miller. He spoke quietly but with an undercurrent of unbreakable authority, reminding Miller that this was federal ground now for all practical purposes. Words weren't needed. The Marine's presence spoke for him. Arthur watched this unfold, his breath slow, absorbing the protective care now surrounding him. He could see Officer Miller shrink under observation, his earlier swagger gone, replaced by guilt and recognition. The Marines remained steady, unwavering. A hush fell as the funeral began its final movement. One Marine rolled Arthur toward the hearing of Eleanor's casket. They matched pace with the procession, each step measured and respectful. Gunnery Sergeant Wallace's eyes remained locked on the casket, then on Arthur, ensuring his charge was treated with dignity. As the flag was folded and presented, Arthur received it, his hands shaky but strong with resolve. The Marines standing around him snapped to attention, giving a crisp salute. At least 20 pairs of eyes from the convoy locked onto Arthur, acknowledging his service, his sacrifice, and this final farewell to his beloved Eleanor. Salutes were returned with a trembling hand. This was no brief show of support. It was a quiet army of respect. Once the ceremony concluded, the Marines gathered into formation behind Arthur. Still in his wheelchair, he was guided gently toward his vehicle by them. Officer Miller was escorted by another Marine out of the area, admonished in words he would carry, but the specifics remained unsaid, left to his conscience. Arthur paused before the hearse one last time. The lead Marine approached and offered a folded note. No signature, no elaborate formality, just a line that spoke volumes. "We stand with you, Sergeant Major." Arthur nodded, eyes misting once again. They rolled him to the limousine waiting nearby. As they lifted him inside, the sense of brotherhood felt as tangible as the flag resting in his lap. The Marine at the door offered a final salute. Arthur returned it, posture straight, despite the tears. When the motorcade pulled away, the cemetery fell into a reverent silence. The Marines remained behind, dismantling the perimeter, ensuring Officer Miller and the funeral director didn't leave before the scene was properly closed. Then they too departed, their convoy slipping away without fanfare. The day Arthur Jenkins lost Eleanor, he nearly lost his dignity too. But the Marines' swift, silent response restored what was momentarily broken. They turned back the tide not with firepower, but with faithful presence, embodying the promise that no veteran, especially on a day of grief, stands alone. In the early morning light, several days after the funeral, Arthur sat with his son, Michael, at a small table in the Jenkins family home. The boxes and canned goods he kept for daily use, simple, careful stockpiles, surrounded them in their modest kitchen. Michael rested a supportive hand on his father's arm. "Pa," he said gently, "the chief called. They're moving forward with disciplinary action." Arthur nodded, heart heavy but resolute. He'd never wanted fame for what happened. He wanted respect. But as the details unfolded, he realized his experience was a catalyst. Officer Miller had been placed on administrative leave pending a disciplinary investigation, standard procedure under city protocol. Yet, Walker's presence and the public outcry had forced decisions far beyond what policy alone would dictate. Within 48 hours, the city council convened an emergency hearing. Local news outlets filled seats in the gallery. Veterans and civilians alike packed the room. Michael watched his father, stooped but dignified, take the witness stand. He heard Arthur's voice, quiet yet steady, recount the moment he collapsed and the unbearable sting of being tased at his wife's funeral. It wasn't a strange protesters or sensationalists. This was a man who had earned every stripe and star, treated as if invisible in the face of authority. General Wallace spoke afterwards, not as a warrior urging battle, but as a citizen demanding justice. He laid out the facts, that Arthur was fully compliant, that mourning does not equal obstinacy, and that Miller's actions violated police protocol and community trust. He introduced testimony from fellow Marines who served alongside Arthur, each attesting to his integrity, and civilian witnesses who saw the incident unfold. The gravity in Wallace's voice carried beyond the dais. It traveled into every heart present. That same day, the City Police Union hosted a tense press conference. The union's president, but justice did not stop there. In a landmark decision, the City Council passed a Veterans Dignity Ordinance, legislation mandating de-escalation training focused on elderly and veteran populations. The ordinance required all officers to receive annual instruction on PTSD, combat-related trauma, and respectful engagement. It also introduced a zero-tolerance policy for the misuse of force at sensitive community events like funerals, memorials, or hospitals. Across town, the mayor signed the ordinance in a quiet ceremony. Arthur and Michael stood beside him, 2 generations of service under one flag. The mayor spoke of healing, calling on citizens to treat veterans not as problems to manage, but as threads woven into the fabric of their community. Arthur's eyes glistened, not with the pain of loss, but with the affirmation of forgotten honor. In the weeks that followed, Arthur found himself gravitating toward the city council chambers. not as a petitioner, but as a voice. He described simple things, how a greeting, a moment of kindness, even a willingness to listen could defend dignity, as Officer Miller, meanwhile, issued a public apology via the department. He spoke haltingly, eyes downcast, acknowledging that pain and loss do not negate a person's right to respect. He described his actions as indefensible and expressed regret. Whether his words are enough will be for the community to judge and for the disciplinary board to. Yet, in that same moment, Arthur accepted the apology with a Marine's magnanimity. He gently extended his hand during the hearing, and Miller accepted it. It wasn't forgiveness as a blanket erasure of wrongdoing. It was an embrace of shared humanity. Pressed by reporters afterward, Arthur said, "Respect begins with accountability and ends with belonging." Small ripple effects followed. Citizens wrote letters to the editor listing grandparents, neighbors, and veterans who deserve simple courtesies. Schools invited Arthur to speak about service, dignity, and healing. Police precincts began sponsoring community dialogues with veterans groups. Memorial Day ceremonies included first-person stories in ways they never had before. Through it all, Arthur remained the unlikely sentinel of change. He lived simply, sleeping in a modest chair, walking with a steady cane on his front porch. Over a cup of tea, Michael once asked his father, "Did all of this happen just for you?" Arthur considered. He smiled softly. "No, son. It happened for the ones who came before me and for the ones who haven't come yet. A single wrong cannot define a lifetime of right, but righting a wrong, that can define a tomorrow." Even weeks after Eleanor was laid to rest, Sergeant Major Arthur Jenkins continued to receive letters, some handwritten in neat cursive, others typed by grandchildren on behalf of aging veterans. They came from all across the country, people who had never met him yet somehow felt they knew him. They wrote of fathers who fought and came home broken, of uncles who never spoke about the war but saluted every time they passed a flag. And they thanked Arthur for standing tall, even when everything else in his life felt like it had collapsed. Arthur never sought recognition, but the pain of that day, being tased outside his wife's funeral, had stirred something larger than his own grief. It had reminded an entire community, and eventually a nation, that respect is not a courtesy to be earned in the moment. It is a lifelong debt owed to those who have given everything in silence. He spent his mornings now walking slowly through Green Hill Cemetery, always stopping by Eleanor's grave with a fresh lily in hand. The Marines from the local reserve unit often joined him. They didn't speak much, sometimes just a shared nod, a hand on the shoulder, or the solemn exchange of salutes was enough. The silence between them held more meaning than any speech could convey. One afternoon, Arthur attended a school assembly where he was asked to speak. Standing in front of children barely old enough to understand war, he said quietly, "Respect begins with listening. Sometimes it means stepping back when someone is in pain. Sometimes it means standing up when someone is being wronged. Either way, it means seeing the humanity in someone before judging what they look like."